Okay, so seeming as your homework is to kind of break down 10 still lifes using our process for drawing for painting, I wanted to make sure I did one as an example. So all I've done here is I grabbed still life. You can choose anything you want. This is from Gauguin, 1881, still life with oranges. And I'm just going to work through the same process. If you notice, all I did here was copy my list from the other Photoshop file that we worked on together in the lecture. And I'm just going to repeat that. I'm just going to do this one much more quickly so that if anybody wanted to have the steps repeated for reinforcing the ideas, they can. So first step, just kind of setting up my frame. I think one thing that should be obvious here that you can pay attention to and hopefully start to look at when you're doing your own this week is that the frame is used very differently in the last one. So what you might have noticed in the last one is that the frame, if we make a little thumbnail up here, and this is a really important part of painting because it gets to what we'll ultimately start working on, which is concept, not just technique. The last image we looked at was symmetrical. So basically meaning that the frame was divided there in half. There was an equal weight to both sides. And what that does is it gives the image a much more static feeling. So symmetry is often used primarily for religious or political imagery because it has an associated sense of authority or power. And this one has a bit more of asymmetry to it. So we can see that there's much more kind of weight on one side, on that right side, in shapes, and even though we haven't talked about it, but in color too. And there's also an additional thing happening here that hasn't happened in the last one, and that's cropping. In the last image we looked at, there was no cropping. And what that does is if you don't crop, you preserve the purity of the frame as something that divides the picture from our world. So it's almost like a window, right? We look through into another world. And if we leave the frame untouched, we don't put objects that challenge it or that break it, it does have more of that illusionistic window. And when you break the frame, like here, you can see there's a vase that kind of hits the frame or the edges. That kind of invites the still life or the picture, whatever it is, doesn't have to be a still life. It's more of an extension of our world, or it includes our world. And at least that's the way that an art historian would describe it or break it down. So that's done. Next step would be my envelope. So I have my frame. I've thought a little bit about what I think is going on. I could even draw my divisions here just to help give it a bit of structure. And now I'm going to move into my next step, which is the envelope. So I'm going to go to those outside edges. So what I see from the top of the vase to kind of where the bowl is, roughly here, down to the orange, maybe to the knife. So that's 1, 2, 3. Remember, I'm trying to keep 4 to 5 lines, and then 4. So this is, I'm kind of thinking this line would hit the bottom of the oranges, and then ultimately the bottom of that vase. So I'm going to bring it up a bit. So that's my shape, right? And so you can see the composition. Just if we look at the way that the shape of the envelope rests on the frame, so think if you can of this is all one solid mass that we're putting against the frame. It's very different than that last one, where the shape was just kind of balanced in the middle. Okay, done. Next is plumb lines. So just thinking about how to break this up, right? So horizontal and verticals, and then I'm just going to start with whatever I think is the easiest thing to find. So what's easy? Well, maybe the bowl. It has like a larger, simpler shape or design. So I'm going to go with, I know where the outer edge is. That's here. And remember, plumb lines is just horizontals and verticals to assign a width and a height. So I see the bowl, I'm going to say it's this wide and this is arbitrary to start, right? So Remember, I'm just doing my best to choose one thing and getting it, and then I can always make corrections if I need. So I'm seeing that it comes up much higher. So I'm going to raise this down to about here. An alternative way that I could have set that up, so maybe we can try this instead too, is maybe it's easier to decide on bigger shapes by looking at a smaller one to start. So maybe it's easier for me to say, well, I think I can guess what this orange is. This is the width and the height. And if I want to double check that, I'm going to count how many oranges tall the vase is. Right? So if I just say that's a height, if I did that 1, 2, 2¼ more times, it should get me to the top of the vase. So 1, 2, okay, that looks pretty good to me. So I'm comfortable with that as the shape for the orange. It also means I could find that vase. So the vase starts just to the left of halfway on that orange. And I'm not going to do any of the curves. I'm going to say that the widest part of the vase, I'm just going to bring it straight up. There. So that's where the mass of the vase is. And then its width, I can see at the bottom, is just roughly above the halfway on the orange. So let's just put it here. So now this is my placeholder for vase. I have another orange that's to the to the left of this guy here. So I'm just going to repeat my basic height and width, but it's a little bit in front. So I'm thinking about T overlap and a little bit lower. So that's how I'm starting to work. Where the oranges split, or where there's the overlap, if I go just above that, that's where the lip of the bowl is. So that would be kind of up here. So that helps me kind of place the bowl. The bottom of the bowl is in line with just below the top of this orange here. So I'm going to draw that across. The height of the bowl, at the very top, it's about halfway on this second orange up. So I'm doing my best to build all these different relationships so I can then kind of work into the picture. One thing I could also do is double check across, right? So it looks like I've left a lot of negative space over here when there probably isn't any. So I should check. If I do a count of oranges, so this repeated across, 3 finds that one, so that's good to know. That's 3 over 4. 4¼ is about the width of the picture. So 1, 3, this is where the cut orange would be. 4, and I'm way off. 1/4. So I usually don't adjust the frame, but I think in this case an easy way to fix my drawing would be to just bring this in. That's why I'm bring some of that frame in. So you don't have to worry about it being kind of a one shot and you either get it or you don't. Right? Drawing is giving us this opportunity to kind of look for things and move things around if we need, and that's going to be quite a bit like what the experience of painting will be as well. Let's reinforce this one, because this is something I'm going to come back to. That's where that orange is. And then I also see this is kind of where the bowl starts. So the bowl would be really at the edge of this second one, a little bit further. So that gives me a whereabouts for that. I have a good idea where that height is. But then here I'm noticing that about the same size, the height and width. There's another orange here. And if I were to do a plumb line, this edge really lines up with the center of this one down here. And I'm just going to give that kind of simple square height and width for its placement. And then doing the same thing, kind of looking at that halfway, I'm trying to place the basic shapes for the other ones that I see in here. There's another that it's more or less kind of balanced on. That's here. And then the bottom of that bowl, it kind of lines up on the halfway point here for that second square. So that would be the bottom kind of lip or edge of that bowl. Here's one more orange back here. And then just one tiny one, or barely overlap there. So that's plumb lines, kind of setting things up to give myself a good opportunity, best opportunity that I can. If you wanted, you can start to subdivide that into diagonals too, right? So I could look for where the outer edge of the bowl is and kind of think of orienting that back to, right? So if I say it starts here and it's ending just inside of that orange and maybe a third of the way down on this one, it can help me get some of these, since that's going to be an ellipse there, some of these difficult ellipses. Do the same thing over here, just a diagonal line, lining it up on the same ground plane. This is going to be the outer edge, and then we're going to have to fit an ellipse into there. If I wanted to get more specific, let's say with that vase, I could say that it's widest, kind of really at about this halfway point, and then here it starts to taper, and so it tapers to a small cylinder that's kind of centered in that. So these are the, as far as dividing this into rectangles or squares, whoops, that would be my shape design. Then I could just fuse a curve in there to help kind of give it a more organic feel. I didn't include the knife, so let's also do that. I'm going to do that with a couple diagonals and just ghosting, thinking about the angle and then the basic shape. But still all straights and purely thinking about placement issues. Okay, so in homework that would be done, and then you can move on to more of your analytical ideas. So if we were to set up that stage, what I'd be thinking about next is primitives. So how can I understand the different objects that I've proportioned out? And just to give you some background, the idea of plumb lines that we've been at that stage that we've probably been spending the most amount of time on early on comes from the Renaissance. And I'll give you an illustration. In the Renaissance, let's say we have a guy drawing. You can see this in some illustrations from Renaissance draftsmen that, or painters, that make work about the process of their drawings or paintings. And so what you often see is a lot of guys with, like big Renaissance hats on and stuff, sitting down at their drawing tables. Renaissance always had big feathers in the hair, or big like billowy shirts or collars or something like that. And so they would be seated at, let's say, like a table. Whatever they're drawing would be over here. So let's say it's, some kind of person. Maybe they're doing a portrait of some kind. And then what you would see in between would be this, like a screen or a mesh. So you would see, like a wire mesh, and it would be dividing into squares. And then what you would see is this exact mesh reproduced on their paper. And so it would be light, but what the artist would do would say, look through this and see in, like C3, whatever is in this square, they could see, right, divided. And so they would just copy that piece into here. And so that's the kind of the inherited history of plumb lines, kind of drawing through a grid or copying from a grid. But because we're painting and not trying to create something photoreal, we just want to something to help us place what we are seeing, we've kind of made a shorthand of it, or plumb lines represent a shorthand of it. So back to primitives, I don't really have any boxes, so we can get rid of those. In this one, this is really more a study in spheres or ellipses. And that's something that you should, when you look for your still lifes, think about. Try to keep it relatively simple. Don't get too complex. Try not to try not to do anything that has like a lot of glass where you're having to see through and, too complex at this stage. But if you can find things of moderate difficulty to kind of challenge you. And so I'm just going to start creating these spheres. So, in between my boxes, I'm going to set up this sphere. And let's introduce an idea that you can, if you want, to add on to this stage. So say, let's call it 4A or 4B. And that's surfacing. This is a really useful idea or way to help get ready for adding paint. But surfacing is basically thinking about what the cross contour or the surface of this volume is. So what I'm doing is taking lines and kind of starting to wrap them around like they're rubber bands. And these should be lines that explore the surface, right? So those are just kind of swinging around the orange, but maybe on this side I see that it kind of dips down and then back up. If you can get into touch with how these lines describe surface, this is the key to understanding rendering, because all light and shadow do is define surface, right? So if I see like a little waver and a bump, that always corresponds to edge or value transition. And what you can see on this one, at least, is if you just look at the way that shadow divides, it follows this surfacing line perfectly. Right? And then all from this point over, it's just shadow. So that's where this kind of process is going. It's going to help us find our light and shadow shapes and define them. But you don't have to do anything that complex. I always just look for a few lines. So let's do it again here. So in my box, I'm just going to create a sphere inside. This is kind of where the stem was, and that start very regular if you want. Just kind of creating a couple surface lines. I'm going to go this way too. And just get an understanding of the inside of that form. And then remember being really clear with those overlaps too. I'm not going to do more lighting because we're going to do that next week. When I start to look for the vase above, I can break the vase into a sphere and a cylinder. So let's say this part is a sphere. I see this much. And then on this side, I really don't see any because it gets cropped. But I'm trying to make it symmetrical. The bottom of this is a cylinder. I don't see a lot. I just see this part. And that can be enough. So just overlap that. If you get confused, you can flip or toggle back and forth with your positive and negative shapes too. Sometimes I don't always keep these steps really independent. I will kind of use them as I go along, double check things as I go along. Like if I want to double check the placement of these two guys, while I'm over here, I could just start looking at the positive, negative shape. So back to our kind of breakdown of this form, and at about this halfway point, this is where if I add a surfacing line, we're starting to taper into something that's now more cylindrical. I have that cylinder up top. All I'm going to do is add two lines that just blend them. So I'm just going to add two curves. Curves, remember, always come at the end after straights. Just makes our lives easier. And then as we get towards the top, it kind of gets a little bit more flared. So anytime you see a complex object, something that isn't one of the primitives kind of perfectly, you can always break it down into component parts. And maybe even this one, I need to like push this to narrow the neck of that a little bit. Just kind of push a C curve instead of a straight there. And then for surfacing lines, you can see that this is curved, and when it gets to this, it gets broader. And that line kind of also speaks to the shadow shape. And I realize some of you may be thinking, like, oh, I thought this was a painting class. Like, what's this guy talking about? Not every time I start a painting will I do every one of these steps. Never, hardly ever will I. But I'm always thinking it. And it's what allows me to understand what it is that I do with paint. So we're starting again with drawing this week just because some of you may not have materials. And this is going to be the best way to get you into a good mindset so that when you do sit down to paint, you are going to have a lot of success. So that one we've done. Let's do the oranges here. So just going to practice our spheres. Do some surfacing on this one. You can start out pretty regular. But like at the top here, if you want, you could try to think about how there's little dips and dives in surface. And this is like the other. So I always try to go both ways, right? One of my lines when I'm surfacing goes with, maybe as far as describing a width. This one's going to describe in the opposite direction for height. This is one down here. So let's do first thing is my curve, setting up the large form. As far as a philosophy to this process, you can, if it helps you to think about what it is that I'm doing, I'm always starting at the biggest concerns. What's the frame? What's the big shape of everything that sits there? How are those things proportioned? And then to the individual. So it's always big to small. And the reason for me it's set up like this is because as a student, I was too obsessed with details. And I would get really nice details at the expense of anything that looked like a nice picture. And so this is a way to help yourself if you have a similar problem to try to avoid my mistakes. So here's the other back there. This is where the stem was. Another guy in here. This might have, too much for homework. I think for homework, you could try to limit the objects to 5 to 7, maybe. And let's put in our big ellipse. So I have, as far as what am I thinking about for the bowl, this is the width. It comes out here. This is squared, so it's going to need to be cut down with ellipses. This is the height. Right, so it's basically this. So remember, ellipse is just a circle in perspective. So I need to try to think of the center of that square, right? So what I did was set up what the top of that bowl was, the width and the height. If it's helpful to you, you can divide that. Remember, that's the major axes for your ellipse. And then when you create your ellipse, just make sure it stays symmetrical to that, and that the widest point, the widest point hangs on that major axis. So I'm going to do a little bit more ghosting. So with some ghosting, it looks a little bit better there. So that would be here. There's my bowl, or at least the top. I'm going to do one more little orange here. That's done. You don't have to get into too much detail. If we wanted, we could say, well, there's like a lip to this bowl. So I would just do a height, and then I could repeat that ellipse below, because they should be exactly the same. It's just kind of a thick ellipse. And then, these straights that I put down aren't correct, really. There's more of an S curve to this. So for the bottom of the bowl, I'm going to do an S, just to give it a little bit more like a realism or realistic reflection of what's there, more natural. And then at the bottom, it continues those ellipses. So there's an ellipse like this, and then there's one below it too. For the surfacing on this, you can if you want. So this is square at lip. This is rounder. And then it kind of jogs over a little bump, and then the platform or the stand, whatever this is called. I don't know. I don't know much about pottery or ceramics. I'm sure there's a name for it. Foot, who knows? Let's do this orange. So here's a modified form. So when you're at this stage and you're looking for your primitives, you have one of two options that you're gonna run into. They can be pure, like this, of your 5, sphere, cone, pyramid, box, or they can be modified. So that means that you have a couple combined, like you did with this one, where you had the sphere and the cylinder, or you can have like this orange, where it's cut in half. So this could be my start, and then I'm noticing it's cut in half. So what I'll do is just create an ellipse at the halfway point and kind of sculpt into it just by exposing that ellipse. So this is kind of that center area. And if I want to be a little bit more precise, this side is a little bit more raised. This side looks a little bit flatter. Then we have the rest of the orange down here. So surfacing on this, to understand its features, this is all very flat, this is rounded. I would try to understand the knife as a really flat, narrow box. So I could give like a little depth there. And then it'd be even more thinned in the actual blade. But I'm not going to see really much of a side or that. This form over here is kind of weird. It doesn't really resemble any of the primitives because it's just kind of like a formless little piece of orange. So I'm going to just describe it more so as a shape, I think. And double check my composition. I put a little too much down here, so I'm going to bring this up. And that might be my last step for the assignment, is just kind of double checking my frame. So I did my best to get the spacing for the whole of the picture. But I'm making a few adjustments. And I don't want to forget that there's a table. These objects aren't just floating. So I'm double checking my negative spaces, the angle of the table. I'm going to put a line here. And then we're going to put a line here. So continuation, although I think I got this a little off. So you can see I screwed up, right? Because either this line's off or I put the bowl too high. But I now notice that the angle of the table hits right here. So I can try putting this down more. Maybe that's a little bit better. But it happens, and mistakes happen. So that's the basics of the assignment for this week. And trying to follow the steps, think about the forms, consider composition. But really, I just want you getting comfortable working, getting familiar with the 5 steps, and describing the information that you see through them. Hope that helps.